All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Safe Conversations. We're really glad that you're able to join us. And Pastor Fred here with Paul. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm good for an old guy.
Paul, for an old guy.
It's different than what good for a 20-year-old would say.
That
You're
is
60,
true.
right?
That is so true. But you're not old. Because if you're old, I'm in trouble.
You're not. I'm not old then.
Yeah, you're not old at all. But Paul, we've been discussing. Wow, what an incredibly serious subject with abuse, and we've kind of focused or zeroed in on sexual abuse, and once in a while we've kind of, I think, referenced all abuse. But you know, this is episode 3 when we've been talking about abuse, and the statistics have been alarming. Whether it's 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 of every girl has experienced this at some level. I mean, there's different levels of this we talked about, but also, you know, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 6 boys. So it's a serious problem. And we're going to kind of focus in here today on the individual that just, what do they do if they've experienced abuse? What do they do, Paul? So I want to begin by just asking a couple of questions, and then we'll kind of get to that point where you can give some, you know, advice on what they can do. But I know we touched on this a little bit, but let me just ask some questions to kind of revisit this for a moment. When a person has experienced abuse, what are some of the consequences of that? Like, let's do it this way. What are some of the physical consequences of an individual that experienced abuse?
Yeah, I'm thinking more if you mean symptoms, like what are some of the symptoms out there. Usually by the time I see them, they're already adult. Okay, so my perspective is going to be a little more adult. So whatever the symptoms are have been developed. So if it's childhood sexual abuse versus adult rape, those I would, both bad, both wrong.
Right.
But I'd separate those. But in my experience, I'm working with people whose abuse was a pretty long time ago. Yeah, childhood. So they can have a variety of physical, psychological, emotional symptoms. And physically, sometimes what shows up, especially for the ladies, can be something as obvious as an eating disorder.
Yeah.
So where that, if you can't control your inside, which is why these eating disorders, one of the reasons we think they come about, you can at least control something outside. So I control food intake, how much I intake, or if I binge purge or whatever. Also, if you think of, now I'm going to blend physical and emotional.
Okay.
Pre-depression can carry just a heaviness and a fatigue, a sleep disruption, appetite disruption to it. Yeah. And the anxiety can do the same thing. So I really see the physical and the emotional pretty much knit together.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you're.
Yeah, it is,
and
those are. Wouldn't they be symptoms as well as consequences in a sense? Because like I'd like to move now to what are some of the psychological consequences if somebody's experienced this? What are some of the things to look for?
And I would say to our audience, consequences does not mean your fault necessarily, depending on what it is, because in its origin, the wounding, I would never tell an abuse survivor, oh, you participated somehow when an adult.
Right.
Even if kids learn to participate, it's because they're forced.
Right.
You know, they just don't do that naturally. Yeah, the consequences really relationally are pretty significant. Because what they've done, and in my abuse, as far as I know, is not sexual. And let me tell the people what I mean or you about that. As someone who had significant problems growing up, I don't close the door that other stuff could show up as I mature.
Okay, that's good.
I do believe God sort of participates in that. What level, at what point do I need to address things? I don't try to intentionally, forcefully recover memories, for instance. I go, Lord, if I need to have them, I need to have them. I work with myself. I don't try to ignore things. Yeah, I would say that that's a significant part of that.
Yeah.
And I totally forgot what you asked me.
Well, we were talking about some psychological consequences too, and we've already talked about this as far as maybe shame would be in that category.
And you
Self-esteem
didn't shame
issues.
me for not remembering where I was.
Yeah.
That was way to go.
That's pretty good.
That was pretty good.
Because you've mentioned your age earlier, and I know that comes
That's a
with the
painful
age thing.
That's a painful thing.
This from a pastor standpoint. Sometimes people, sometimes they just feel unholy dirty.
Mm-hmm.
If that's a word for it.
They were often made. Now, realize that this is my experience, and not everybody has this, but often they were told that by the abuser. Or when they went and told somebody, they would be blamed for it or said, that's just nasty, why? And people could even be well-intending, just ignorant as the dirt,
And, unfortunately, I think sometimes that happens in the church world.
It does.
I think that comes from religion and church a lot of times. And again, as a pastor that's, deals with this, there's also these social consequences, if you will, sometimes difficulty in relationship, marriage issues.
It does.
Because of this.
Yeah, there is literally a deep, deep hunger for connect that's very rich and safe that can appear in dating and early marriage. And then you get into the real life of marriage where it's reciprocal and you're having to meet somebody's needs and they're trying to meet yours. And then that intimacy and that closeness, it can actually trigger the old pain.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not a marital issue between the two.
Right.
It becomes one because of the trauma. And my wife and I have dealt with that, with some of the physical trauma where I could get easily triggered by even something like a raised voice. And all of a sudden I'm sort of back there with Dad raging, in my brain.
Right. Right. Well, and I know this safe conversation, so we're dealing with, whatever the subject. And in my experience pastoring an individual who had just gotten married, and this was a male who was molested by an uncle who had trouble even with the sexual connection with his spouse.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
and then without being able to talk about it because of the shame, and then the spouse thinks, what's wrong with me? What's going on here? And it's creating significant issues in their marriage. So the social consequences can be.
No, they're really, there's not an arena of the life that's not touched. If you think of, we've got a will and we've got a spirit, and we've got thoughts and we've got emotions and relationships and behavior, none of that is bypassed by abuse. We would know this from not sexual abuse, but PTSD with our veterans, right, that it has an adult impact that, can you imagine a child trying to carry that type trauma? Right. And it's actually more severe in a sexual sense. There's something, Fred, that is soulishly wounding about a sexual offense on a child. It's not just, I'm not saying I'm better off because all I know of is physical, emotional abuse, but there is a deeper wounding with that sexual abuse.
So somebody's out there listening to this, and they've never really dealt with it, but abuse is in their past.
Yes.
So could you speak to them right now and say, encourage them a little bit of what do they need to do? What should they expect if they reach out for help? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, let me start with just some of the general symptoms we've talked about, or some of the consequences. Addictions are a way that a person tries to feel something different than what they're really feeling. Now, I'm talking about at the beginning end of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hurting at a level 10 and it hurts so bad. But if I take this drink, or if I'm physically intimate, or if I live on my phone, my food intake,
Yeah.
it is the way I look at it is through the lens of they learn to survive this way. It's not just they are an addict. This addiction kept them alive way back in the day, a lesser form of that. So if a person is going, I don't think I was abused, or it really wasn't that bad, or because I'll hear this a lot, or it was just one time, or I don't think they meant to do that, or it wasn't intercourse. I'm going like the violation to the soul doesn't require intercourse. It can actually be something. This is not innocent, but compared to intercourse, it's lesser. A dad or an uncle or granddad walking into the bathroom when the young girl's in the shower, then they just walk in and out. That's horribly offensive if that begins to move in the wrong direction. So what I would say to people is, look at the consequences, look at the symptoms, and I would say cycles of depression, cycles of anxiety, cycles of a real self-hatred. And I don't mean kind of messed up. It's I am a mess up. It's a shame, using your word earlier, it's a shame-based thing. If they begin to look at those and they don't stop, like it's not just environmentally induced depression, which means I have a lot of debt, I just lost my job, my wife and I are having problems. If it's not that, then what I would say professionally is it's coming from somewhere in your history. You don't accidentally, it's very rare to have a pure 100% organic depression, anxiety. They do exist. I know doctors treat them, but usually there is an originating issue, situation that occurs. And what I would say to them, and this would be what I'd like people to take away, people are so valuable to God and the kingdom that they deserve to get help.
That's good. I like that.
Yeah. They deserve to get better, because somewhere inside, I know in myself, is that as a Christian, I shouldn't be having this depression, shouldn't be having this anxiety. And then, of course, the more I look, you're going like, yeah, you really should have some of that based on the context of not just today, but your whole life. And what I would say to them is I would seek out safe relationships. And if they don't know how, I would read, I would look, Townsend or Cloud, one of them has a book about safe people. I don't know if you remember this one, or How to Find Safe People.
Yeah. I think it's Henry Cloud does.
Cloud.
Yeah, and they do a lot of work together, though.
Yes.
Those two.
Yeah.
It's a good resource.
Yeah.
So what we're kind of saying here is that if an individual is limited in their ability to function on a normal basis due to this issue, or it's even possible that their limits are due to this and not even aware of it.
That's real possible. Yeah, when you start looking at having a bad day 3 times a week versus having a bad day once a month, that's very different. And I would have them even journal some of that. I mean, I don't mean write it all out, but note that, gosh, I had 3, because what will happen if it's an abuse situation that's going to be really distressing is those cycles will get closer. And the way you prevent a literal breakdown of the person is you catch it before it gets to the point that the defense mechanisms no longer work. There comes a point, we used to call it midlife crisis, we called it a lot of things, but no longer is avoiding working, no longer is drinking a little working. So I would say catch it earlier. It's not as embedded in the neurology in that sense, as far as habited, even though it's hard and it's not good. I would tell them that it's never their fault. I don't care what the people said, if it's childhood abuse or otherwise.
good,
No one should do that. And I would say I might report the friggin' crap out of that stuff. I'm one who believes that I'm not going to go, well, should we? No, you report that. That's inappropriate. The church needs to, and we're both part of the church, but we need to get that one.
So as we start kind of drawing this to an end and these, 3 discussions about abuse, is there anything else that you're thinking, hey, we need to just mention this briefly?
Yeah, I would say if it's possible, and there are different levels of care, but professional care that has some training in this area. Counselors do not come out of their training usually with a trauma foundation that's strong.
Okay.
So I don't say don't go to a new therapist that's just starting, but they need to have some equipping and some abilities to address this and to stay with your pain, and what do you do with it, and do they have good references as far as referral sources. And I would tell them there really is hope. Yeah, it was dark some of the time, and there were people who gave me simple answers and kind of wanted to bust them in the chops, because I knew to read my Bible. I got that one, and I'm not trying to be unkind, but I feel this sort of in my body that you might have helped yourself, but you didn't help me. I've already got that one down.
Yeah, that's good, Paul. Because I do think a lot of times from the Christian perspective, it makes us feel better to say those kind of bad things.
I think my background scares people. Like, gosh, I don't want to step over and what do I do? And I'm going like, don't reject me. Yeah. Please
just don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, from a pastor's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of issue I deal with on a consistent basis, whether it's abuse or the tragedy that happens. And it comes into the issue of theodicy, and from our background, or the problem of evil and suffering.
Yes.
I have to be honest with you. I think it's, from my perspective, it would be the number one reason I abandoned faith.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would. It would be the number one reason when I looked at all of this. It's like, wow, how does God, where is God in all of this? And I think a lot of people ask that question. And so from a pastor's perspective, I wanted to add this caveat.
Real quick, it's okay for them to ask that question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they need to be able to ask you or me whether or not we even have a decent answer.
Oh, absolutely. That's good, because yesterday, I had read it somewhere. I tweeted out this statement that the same Bible that says rejoice always has a book called Lamentations.
Mm-hmm.
And the Psalms are full of
Yep.
Individuals wrestling
About a third of
with their emotions and where was God, and they had this concept of God that everything would work great if you did good, and the bad people, it would go bad, and then that's not what was happening. And so all I want to say is the abuse that happened to you, God did not cause it.
That's right.
He didn't do it.
Yeah.
And I know that leaves, and we don't have time and to go into that answer, which is not really an answer because people have been talking about this for a long time. I just wanted to say God didn't cause that abuse.
Mm-hmm.
He did not. And this is just a complex world we live in, and we don't understand it all. And but I do believe God has the ability in the end to put everything back together.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe in the age to come, God is going to be able to put all of these things back together in a perfect way, and a perfect justice and healing will take place. And that's our hope.
Yes.
That's our hope. But, until that happens, I appreciate the advice that you've given over the last 3 episodes, because this is a big problem
Yeah.
that's not going away. And real quick, for any church leaders that are maybe watching, myself as a church leader and church leaders that are watching, any recommendations for the church dealing with this issue?
Yeah, I think the church needs to have this issue on, like, think of a circular radar screen on their radar screen because of the stats. They're out there everywhere. If you think of even 1 in 5, let's bump it up a little bit,
Right.
what I really think it is or you think it is. You just count every fifth gal in your church. That's a lot. And then you ask, what can we do to help them feel safe so they might talk about that?
Right.
And then I would be intentional about implementing some things that would create that safety and trust. And that's what we do therapeutically. If we're not trustworthy and we're not safe, they're not going to talk.
True.
So we've got to.
Good. Thank you, Paul.
Mhm.
Thank you, everybody.